Hey there drone fans, Rick here again from Drone Valley. Today I want to give you my overview of the DJI Mavic Pro Quad. Now I've spent a lot of time with this quad over the last couple of weeks on purpose. I know there's a lot of overviews that are out there already, and I'm not a big fan of rushing into an overview without actually spending a lot of time around the technology so I can give you some of my insight into how it actually works in practice. I've uncovered a lot of really cool things about this quad and some things that are not so cool, and I couldn't possibly fit everything into one clip or I'd be talking for 45 minutes and nobody wants to hear that. So what I'm going to do is the overview today. I've got a second clip that I'm working on that goes into much more detail around the core technology behind this and how incredibly cool it is. And then I've seen a lot of scuttlebutt on the net and people have asked me questions about the flyaways and the crashes that have happened on some of the Mavics that are out there. So I spent a little bit of time thinking about why that may be happening, and I think I have a couple of theories as to things you want to be aware of so that you don't suffer that fate. And I have to do a third clip to explain that. So there'll be a bunch of these coming out hopefully during this week, but it depends on how much time I get to actually film. Anyway, before I get into this too deeply, let me talk a little bit about this drone. You can tell by my previous clips that I'm a huge fan of this technology. I'm turning into a fanboy about the Mavic for a couple of key reasons. Because from an engineering perspective, this is radically different than anything else that's been released up to this point. It's smaller, it's foldable, it's less expensive. All three of those things individually would be a gigantic challenge for any company. So can you imagine the guy that had the guts to run up to the corporate office from engineering and say, I'm going to build you guys a new quad. You already have a professional quad with the Inspire and your commercial versions. You've got a prosumer quad and the drone line for the Phantom. I'm going to build you one that's below that. I'm going to build you a Mavic. And this Mavic is going to be smaller, it's going to be less expensive, and it's going to fold. Now, any one of those three would have been incredible. If you just walked in and said, I'm going to make it smaller, that's enough of a reason to develop the quad. But the fact that it's smaller and it can fold, and you're selling it for less is just incredible. Because when you think about just the smaller part of it, right? So shrinking a quad down or shrinking any electronics down, the big challenges you have are the smaller you make that product, the closer the boards get together, and you've got radio frequency interference, you've got issues with trying to solder and work on a board that small, you've got all kinds of problems. The second thing is the more you put components closer together, the hotter the thing gets, right? So you've got cooling issues now you have to contend with. So that would have been a big enough engineering challenge just to make it smaller. On top of that, when you add in the fact that I can fold it up, and I'm folding up the airframe, I'm folding up essentially the arms that hold the motor. So you can imagine the stress on that, and the torque on that, and the mechanism to hold it out there and keep it out there. I mean, that's a whole nother engineering challenge that, again, would have been a generational move. Then to say, on top of that, it's going to sell for less than our Phantom 4, that makes no sense to me. And I know I'm going to get heat for this, but this should be a $1,500 or $2,000 quad just based on what it brings to the market compared to other drones that are out there today. So the fact that they could make it smaller, make it folding, and introduce it at a lower price point, how could you not be a fan of this technology? Plus, look how cute it is sitting there with its arms up. So anyway, let me get into the core product and why I think it's so cool. So before I get too deep into it, there's a couple of things you need to know before you start playing with the quad. It has to do with folding out the arms. Now, it looks like you can fold them out in any order you want. You can actually. You want to fold the top ones out first, then I hold it by the bottom when I do that. Then I flip it over and actually fold the bottom ones out. And that way you're not hitting the propellers, you don't have to worry about banging the propellers. So if I go around to the quad itself and do a little investigation, you'll notice there are two doors. There's one on the right side and there's one on the left side. The one on the right side is the most interesting door. It's the one you'll probably use the most. When you open that up, inside there are a couple of different things. You've got your SIM card, which fits inside that side, and you've got just above it a switch that you can switch between using the controller, using your phone for Wi-Fi. And to the right of it, there's a couple of things that most people have asked me about. There's a button and there's a light below it. And what that button does is if you lose connection with your controller, that's how you rebind your controller with the actual quad. You won't have to mess with that because when it comes out of the box, the controller you have is bound to the drone, so you're not going to have to hit that. But if you have to change controllers or replace your controller, you may have to bind the new controller to the drone. So essentially, you could leave that closed. Now, I like taking the SIM card out. When I record something, I'll pull the SIM card out and move it to my computer. But you don't have to do that because on the other side, this little door opens up. Whoops, pops off too. This little door has a micro USB connection. So if you want, you can actually connect your computer up to the quad and you can move the videos off the quad by using that connection right there. I don't do that. I pulled a SIM card out on mine to do it, so it's not a big deal for me, but that is kind of nice. That's also where you're going to grab logs and flight information off the quad. So there's stuff stored internally that you may want to pull off on that side. All right, so looking around the front of the quad, you've got two visual positioning sensors right here, and these are the ones that are used for avoiding crashes. So you've got these forward-looking sensors, then you've got this dome, this protective dome around the camera, and I'd mentioned in one of my other clips on how to remove the dome. Now the dome on mine has this silicone cover on it. I leave that on there just because when I'm transporting it I don't want to scratch the dome underneath, but that just pulls right off, that's easy. Then the dome comes off by releasing this catch below it. So if you pull up on this catch, this slides out. So let me do that. I'll pull up on the catch. Let me do it from this side to make it easier. I'll pull up on the catch and pull the dome off, so the dome comes off. And then underneath it, you've got a gimbal lock. And this comes out of the box with the gimbal lock on it. Don't throw this gimbal lock away. That's something you're going to want to put on there every time you transport the drone, because you don't want that gimbal bouncing around inside your case. This comes off very simply. You just squeeze it, pull it straight down, and you can see the gimbal is moving now, so that's loose. So put those three aside. Those are ones you're going to want to keep. Now in a previous video, I had people ask me, can I fly this with this on there? So they said, can I leave this on there and fly it? And honestly, the flying tests weren't that bad. You could leave it on there, and there's a little bit of glare if you went towards the sun, but for most of the flying, you'd get away with that. I'm here to tell you, after I did that clip, I discovered a couple of different reasons why you don't want to fly with this gimbal guard on. So don't fly with the gimbal guard on, because honestly, if you look behind the camera, you'll notice, if you look very closely, that there are vents back there. And those vents are super critical to the cooling of this quad. That actually, behind that vent is a fan internally that pulls air through there at a pretty good velocity. And if you put that gimbal cover on, that gimbal protector cover on, you're going to block the airflow going through that drone, and it's going to overheat. So you're going to have major issues with the drone. So even though you can fly with this on, I don't recommend you fly with it on. And I've got another clip that's going to show you exactly how hot this gets with that on and with it off. So keep that gimbal guard off. I do want to talk about the bottom a little bit. So when you look at the bottom of the quad, what you've got here are a couple of sensors. Two of them are pretty standard. These are your ultrasonic sensors, and these are used for sort of checking the ground and making sure there's no hazards below it. You've got two optical sensors, visual positioning sensors on there as well, and those are there to sort of aid it when you're flying it indoors, because it has no GPS signal indoors, so it can keep track of the ground. And when you put it into tripod mode, that's what keeps it pinned to a particular location, so it's not going to move around. So the combination of the ultrasonic sensors here in the center and these two visual positioning sensors over here really give this thing a rock solid performance. It'll definitely stay in place. So the only other thing I wanted to talk about that I got a lot of questions about was the camera mounts. Now if you remember on the Phantom 4 you had camera mounts that were replaceable. I was a little disappointed to find that the camera mounts inside here, even though they're replaceable, are almost impossible to get to. You've got to really gently move the gimbal out of the way and get in there with a set of tweezers, and they're not that substantial. At first glance they actually look like some type of rubber band. I'm sure it's a high performance rubber band, but that does scare me a little bit because that's going to wear over time. So I want to make sure that I can change those pretty easily, and you can get in around the gimbal if you're careful, but it looks like you're doing brain surgery in there, so just be aware of that. And that's why it's super important to keep this gimbal guard on, or I should say the gimbal lock on, because the gimbal lock will hold that in a fixed position, in a frozen position when you transport it, because every time it jiggles like that, whether you're flying it or you're actually having it in your case and it's bouncing around, you're putting fatigue on those particular those camera mounts up front. You don't want to do that. You want to minimize that as much as possible. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the blades a little bit. So the blades are different, and what's interesting about everything about this quad is different, but the blades are another point that are different. Now, there's nothing special about folding blades. There have been folding blades out by aftermarket companies for years for the Phantom series of products. I've used them. I like them an awful lot. They fly just as well, in my opinion, as a fixed blade, but they give you the ability to sort of make the drone smaller. What worries me a little bit, or concerns me a little bit about these, it's a brand new design. So what DJI did was come up with their own blade and their own mounting system. So when people ask me, does the Phantom 4 and the new Mavic mount the same way? Do the blades attach the same way? The answer is they kind of do and they kind of don't. They kind of do because you push down and twist them and they've got that lock to spring back up. They don't in the sense that they're different. They're not the same blades. So they are fundamentally different, and you can tell the identification of the blades by looking at the hubs. So the hubs here are white, the blade's got a white ring on it. The hub is black, it's got a black ring on it. So that's how you identify where the actual blade goes. To remove the blade, it's the same kind of functionality you had before. So you're going to hold the motor, and when you're holding the motor, you're going to push down on the blade and you're going to twist the blade. So in this case, I'll push down and twist, and then they pull off. You'll notice that they settle on the shaft a lot tighter than the Phantom 4s do. The Phantom 4s seem to pop right off. These you got to work a little bit because that hole in the center there is almost the exact same dimensions as what the shaft is. So it takes a little bit of work to get them off. Now, looking at the blades, I talk about single points of failure, things that'll bring this drone to the ground. One of them is the blades. So if you have a blade failure, this can't fly with 3 blades, so it's coming down. The challenge with these, not being a fixed blade, is that on the Phantom 4, they were fixed blades. but they were plastic attachments on the bottom here and a plastic housing here. So I was worried that the plastic on plastic over time would fatigue. So one thing I would recommend is every 10 flights or so, or 20 flights, take the blades off and inspect these. Make sure these fingers are on there tight, there's no chips or nicks or nothing's missing there. But the other thing you want to be very careful about, this is a pretty good test for the blades, is these have rivets in the center. You can see them there, and I'll do a blow up of it. But I've got rivets in the center there, and those rivets are what hold the actual blades to the base. That's a point of huge stress for them. So a good test for this is if you're holding the blade by one end and it stays stiff, that means those rivets are set pretty tightly. If you hold it by one end and this end droops down, that means that that rivet on that side is getting lazy. And it may actually droop down here, so maybe it droops down like that. That means that rivet's getting lazy. So the test I like to do is hold it by one end, and if it doesn't droop, I know the blade's in pretty good shape and the rivets are seated. And you know, make sure you always check the edge of these too. I talk about that a lot, because in one of the clips I did, I talked about the ground clearance. That ground clearance in the back is non-existent, and you're going to catch grass and weeds and other things, maybe leaves and stuff, that are going to cause nicks on that blade. So always check the edges of those blades. Now, I'm going to do a blow up of this because it's hard to show it up here close, but if you look at the base of this, the actual plastic mounting base is new, and the spring assembly, the part that keeps the blade off of the actual motor or tight to the motor, is different as well. In the Phantom 4, you had little fingers down here that were spring metal that pushed up against the blade and kept it up, and there were 3 of them, which is kind of good because if one of them failed, the other 2 should give you enough tension to keep the blade fully seated. Here you've got just a spring on that center shaft, and again I'll do a blow up of it, but there's a spring on that center shaft that's held in by this bottom disc. So it's underneath the disc and you screw that disc down on top of it. That's something you want to check an awful lot too. So when you pull the blades off to do your inspection of the blades, make sure you check that spring as well, because over time the fatigue on that spring, even though it's spring metal, could definitely cause you problems. So you want to make sure it's all there, it's not loose on there, and if it is, you're going to have to change that out. Now I'm sure kits will come out. You may even get the kits with the blades. I haven't gotten any replacement blades yet ordered, but you may actually get the kit of this disc, the spring, the screws, and the blade as part of a kit. And we'll see how that matures. All right, the last thing I want to talk about, and I got a lot of questions about this, is the way the arms lock. So a lot of people ask me, what's the locking mechanism like on these arms? You can feel that there's a certain pivot to it, and there's definitely a spring action to hold it all the way out. So 2 things I will tell you about that is obviously this is fragile stuff, and the actual contact point when you fold this one out in the back, I don't know if you can see it there, the contact point when it's folded out is right there. That's the stop of how far this will move. If you let this go halfway and snap open, there's a good chance you're going to break that. And if you break that, this arm will flip all the way around and it's done. You have to actually send it in to get it replaced. So when you're folding out these arms, you want to hold on to them the entire travel. You don't want to let go of them because they're going to snap into place. Another thing I've heard some people ask me, and they've had issues with this, is they wondered, with the folding and unfolding of this, do the wires from the motor get pinched in the arm? So there's 2 things you want to look at carefully. First of all, they won't, because they're inside of basically a protector, if you will, a little sleeve inside there. So when you're closing this, you're not closing it on the wires, you're closing it on the sleeve, so it gives it plenty of protection. But there's a little cover on these front arms right here that I understand some of them may have been shipped without. You want to make sure that cover's there. If that cover's not there, get a hold of DJI. They probably can send you one. You probably don't want to send your drone back, but in the meantime, put a piece of tape on there to keep that cable inside there, so when you fold it closed, you're not pinching that cable. It's very, very important. The last thing I'll talk about with the blades is if you look closely here, you've got little divots in them. Those divots marry up perfectly with the battery so that you can actually keep the battery in the drone when you close this and have plenty of room there where it's not going to impact it tightly. That also holds the battery in. One of the other engineering changes that DJI made with this drone, which I think is a positive, is one of the concerns I had as a single point of failure in the Phantom and older drones was the battery slid in from the side. And even though you pushed it in there and you felt like it clicked in, it could feel like it's in, but it's not fully seated. And the challenge there is through the vibrations of that drone, that battery could back itself out slowly to where it either broke connection with the drone, which meant drone has no power, it's coming down, or battery actually in a bank could slide out of the drone and come down itself like a missile. So by changing that to a battery that drops in from the top, there's no chance of that happening. So that battery's going to sit there and gravity's going to keep it in the drone. You can't flip the drone over, so it's never going to shake out. But having the battery come in from the top means that it's a very secure connection, and gravity's on your side. Gravity's your friend in this case, because even if it isn't fully seated in the drone, the fact that gravity's pushing it down means it's always going to give it the best possible connection to those electrical contacts in the front. So that's really good. I think the last thing I wanted to talk about was the replacement of these, because people ask me about, well, gee, those springs aren't exposed, how do I get to them? And what's interesting about that, and I'll talk about this more in the next clip, is there are so many patents on this drone about different technologies inside there, and one of their big patents has to do with that spring assembly. It's a dramatically new design for them, and what you've got inside that shaft is you've got a spring under tension that is held in place at one end and then held to the arm in the other end. So it's in the tensioned position when it's closed. When you open it up, you're adding tension to it, so it closes naturally. That's what keeps it in the open position. But inside there is where the wires pass through, and they're claiming that you can get 5,000 opens and closes on this. I'm sure you'll get more than that, but that's a conservative number. But over time, those could fatigue and have to be changed. And and again, I'll talk about this a little bit more in the next clip. It doesn't look like it's impossible to do, but it looks like a pretty big deal to change those. So hopefully we're not going to have any fatigue problems with those over time. And again, I'm going to fly this thing an awful lot over the next couple of months, and I'll let you know if these start getting sloppy, because the challenge is if that spring gets sloppy and this thing can fly back on its own, now you've got blades that are impacting each other. Let me do it this way, it might be easier to see it. You've got blades that could be impacting each other. If this flies back too far, you're going to actually have blades necking each other. So having that fully extended and that fully extended is a really positive thing. So always, when you let these things go, make sure they fully seat and that there's no play. You can't push down and it's not moving. Again, with this one, not moving, and not moving. So it'll assure you that you've got full extension on the arms and you've got full spring tension on the arms. Short of that, that's all I really wanted to talk about today. And again, I've got 2 more clips coming. I did spend a lot of time with this drone, like I said, over the last couple of weeks. Inside the drone, I've discovered quite a few things that are kind of interesting, again, that's separated from other drones. So I'll get into those in the next clip. But please, if I've missed anything you want me to talk about, drop it in the comments below and I'll make sure I add it to the next clip. I love doing these clips and I really love flying this particular quad. And I know I've said it before, a lot of you are extremely frustrated that the delay of this thing has been so long going. And I think, I'm not going to defend DJI because I gave them a hard time in one of my clips about not letting us know what's going on. I still feel like they released the drone early in response to the Karma product, which really wasn't fair to us because we bought it and paid for it. But I know they're shipping them now in quantities and they're doing their best to catch up. Don't let that put you off. I'm not a DJI guy. I don't make money selling their stuff. I don't work for them. But if you're looking for a drone today, the sophistication of this drone, again, I keep comparing it to a Swiss watch. It's really built with that level of precision. The engineering in this product, both outside and inside, which the next clip will go into, is just right up there with some of the best products on the planet today. So if you're thinking the quality of design of this and the fit and form of this compared to an Apple product or a Samsung product or a Google product, it's really up there with that branded manufacturer. And I fully expect it to pull this thing open and just see a mess inside there of really disconnected circuits and things that didn't play together well. When I tore this guy apart, what I found inside there was a very well-engineered product. So this thing is built to last. The price is right. And honestly, I've flown it a bunch. I just love it. It's way more sleek and sophisticated than anything I've flown before, and more responsive. And I'll use the word nimble. It is a very, very nimble craft compared to some of the other stuff. Now, I'm not saying I'm not going to fly any of the others. I still love my Phantom series of products, and I fly the unique products as well. I like them a lot. But for me, for travel especially, this is the way to go for me. So if you're on the fence and you're mad at DJI, get over it. Order the drone if you can. If you're really looking for a drone, you want to fly in the spring, get it on order now, and that way you'll have it when the spring hits. All right, so that's all I had for today. Again, if you have questions, please don't flame me. I'm doing my best to stay ahead of the curve on some of this stuff, but if you have questions, let me know, and I'll get back to you on those questions. And I love doing these clips, as I always say, so if you guys are enjoying them as well, I'll continue to make them. Until then, fly safe and have fun with your drones. See you soon.